Kenneth Bailey, who has written quite a bit on parables, calls Jesus Christ a metaphoric theologian. In other words, Jesus is giving us knowledge about God. He's a theologian. But he packages that knowledge about God in metaphor, which makes the interpretation of parables a little challenging. Because metaphor obviously is a figure of speech and contains figures of speech, images, symbols. Some might even say, like the book of Revelation, apocalyptic type of images. So if Jesus is this metaphoric theologian that Kenneth Bailey talks about, probably we're going to need all the resources we can gather to interpret these stories of Jesus, these upside-down stories of the dynamic reign of God in our lives. Best sources we can pull together are going to help us. So in this session, I just want to talk about what some of those resources might be. And you might make yourself available to them or make them available to you. One of the sources, and I'll start with this because it's probably the latest and the best and the biggest, the Stories with Intent by Kenneth Snodgrass. Now, Dr. Snodgrass, the subtitle of this book is A Comprehensive Guide to the Parables of Jesus, and it's comprehensive. This boy has done his homework. In fact, there are 142 pages of end notes, small print. Not footnotes or parenthetical notes, but notes at the end of the book for all the assertions he's made in the study. This is very, very thorough. Kenneth Snodgrass was the same guy that wrote the little dictionary article in the InterVarsity Press book, Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. So he is clearly looked to in our day and time as an authority on the subject of parables, at least in the English-speaking world. What I find about this tool to be so helpful is twofold. One, it's kind of a sanity check. After listening to all the other people that talk about parables, he kind of brings us back to ground zero, and we're able to say, okay, now wait a minute, the parable can't mean that, but it could mean this. And so it's just a careful, scholarly way to get at this. The other thing that makes this tool so valuable is that he always, as he treats every one of the 40 or so parables, he just gives the Greco-Roman background, he gives the Old Testament background, he gives the Judaism background, the rabbinic background. He traces any parallels to the parable in the Gospels that you can find anywhere. So in addition to knowing the parable landscape and who's out there and who's writing stuff, Dr. Snodgrass has done us a big favor. This is very, very thorough. Now, the fellow I quoted a minute ago, Kenneth Bailey, that called Jesus a metaphoric theologian, wrote a book, two books that were put together as one, and then I'm going to mention another one that he has done, entitled Poet and Peasant, and then the other book combined with it was Through Peasant Eyes. The subtitle, A Literary-Cultural Approach to the Parables in Luke. So he's really not dealing with Matthew, Mark, or some might even say, well, there are no parables in John per se. You have figures of speech in John that are parabolic, I guess you could argue. But anyway, what makes this so valuable is that not only his literary work, he's studied how these parables move, like the parable of the prodigal son, the most famous one. He talks about it being a chiastic structure, like the point of an arrow going somewhere. It moves this way, then it moves the other way, but the point of it all is at that tip of the arrow. He's done a lot of work that way, but the value of this for me is the cultural setting, the cultural background. Kenneth Bailey lived for many years in Lebanon, in the Middle East. So he knows the culture. He knows the Middle Eastern mind. When we read the parables of Jesus, we read them from a Western point of view. When I think about a man going out to sow seed, I grew up in Iowa, so I think of a John Deere tractor and a farmer. But that's, of course, not what Jesus had in mind, and the people that would have heard him, they had a reservoir from which to understand this, and that wasn't in it. Not a tractor, that's for sure. So you need somebody who can help you understand the backdrop to this. In parable study, especially parable presentation, when we're teaching and preaching on these things, we want to be careful that we don't make the background the foreground. However, we will misinterpret if we don't look at the background. Kenneth Bailey's great for this. Here's what he did. During his time in the Middle East, he would go out to the Bedouin shepherds of the Middle East, whose lifestyle has probably not changed for 1,000 years. Now, that's not back to the time of Christ, but it's still a long time ago. And he's thinking maybe how they respond to the parables of Jesus is how people in Jesus' day would have responded. So he'll read them like, again, the most famous parable that we'll refer to many times, the parable of the prodigal son. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger came to his father and said, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And as soon as Kenneth Bailey read that, all the Bedouin shepherds went, "Huh!" They covered their mouths. Kenneth Bailey didn't understand that, so he read again. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger came to his father and said, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And everyone went, "Huh!" And Kenneth Bailey said, Why do you do that? Why do you keep doing that?" And they said, "Well, no boy in the Middle East would ever do that. Because in this shame-honor culture, you would never shame your father by acting that rebellious. What the boy is asking the dad to do is to drop dead before his time." So we just miss that. We read that story, we think, okay, the little snotty kid, he's being rebellious, he ought to be spanked. No, it's deeper than that. Now, there are people like Klein Snodgrass that say that Kenneth Bailey has gone too far. A, 1,000 years is not 2,000 years. B, can we really recreate all the historical background as it was in the days of Jesus? Well, the answer is probably no. And so Snodgrass is good for the sanity check, if you will. On the other hand, some of these are quite colorful. Certainly more colorful if some of that rich backdrop is brought in. So Kenneth Bailey has done us a big favor by talking about that. Another book that is along those lines is his book called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, Cultural Studies in the Gospels. This one goes beyond parables to miracle stories and teachings, encounters, discourses. How all of the teachings of Jesus would have sounded to the people of his day. As odd as they might sound to us at times, those people had a reservoir in the back of their brains from which they could interpret these things, and especially relates to the parables. So these books are kind of alike, and I would say they are 2, 3 of the finest works on parables there are. Let me shift gears a little bit and talk to you about another book that can take us a long way in our understanding of Jesus' parables. This is by one of my teachers at Denver Seminary. His name is Dr. Craig Blomberg. And Dr. Blomberg did his PhD dissertation on the parables of Luke in the travel narrative. He did his study under the great Methodist scholar I. Howard Marshall in King's College in Aberdeen, Scotland. But let me talk to you about what that means. Luke chapters 9 to 19 is a rather unique section of Luke. Oh, that doesn't mean you can't find parallel passages here and there in Matthew and Mark, maybe even a little bit from time to time in John. But it means that the material in chapters 9 to 19 is rather unique to Luke. You won't find most of it in Matthew, certainly not in Mark. And that section is called by the scholars the travel narrative because Jesus is always going up to Jerusalem. He's going up to Jerusalem to accomplish our redemption on the cross. And the reason is because Luke is writing 2 volumes, the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. Well, in the Book of Acts, you got to get the gospel out of Jerusalem. The only way to get the gospel out of Jerusalem is you got to get to Jerusalem. So Jesus is always going up. Yes, Luke is making a topographical statement. He's making a geographical statement, but he's also making a theological statement. And in that unique section of Luke, there are 18 parables. Some of the very most well-known. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Some people don't even know if that's a parable per se, because Jesus names one of the individuals in it. But Dr. Blomberg made that a special study, and there are 2 or 3 things about his book that are very significant to understand. One is he noticed that a lot of the parables of Jesus had 3 characters or 3 points or 3 scenes to them. Sometimes they were just a contrast, so there'd be 2, and Jewish people love the contrast on the one hand. On the other hand, they're big on that. But oftentimes there were sets of 3. Sometimes he'll call them complex 3-point parables. Like you have the parable of the sower and the 4 soils. He would say 3 of those soils were bad, 1 was good, so the 3 function as 1. You have the good soil, and then you've got the sower with his seed. Thus, 3. Maybe he stretches that a bit, but nonetheless, that's where he was coming from in some of his writing. But the bigger issue for me about this particular book is that he's suggesting that there is a place for allegory in the study of the parables. Now, in the last number of years, there'd be a lot of scholars to say, no. It doesn't mean several things. It just means one thing, and we got to extrapolate what that one thing is. All the rest of this stuff is just window dressing. Well, Dr. Blomberg says, no, not so much. For years, the church understood these stories somewhat as an allegory. Now, if you went to a university and took a literature class and you studied figures of speech, probably they'd talk about parable almost as a synonym to allegory. They sound so similar in the secular world. What we mean by allegorization in Scripture study is assigning a meaning that the author didn't intend. That's a difference. If there's intended allegory, that's one thing. But if it's assigning a meaning that the author didn't mean, we don't want to go there. But Dr. Blomberg is saying, but wait a minute. Maybe not everything in the parable is allegorical, but maybe some things are, specifically the main characters. Dr. Blomberg's thesis is that if there's allegorization in the parables, it lies within the main characters. Now just think about this for a minute. Again, referencing the prodigal son, it makes perfect sense. If the young boy represents the tax collectors and the harlots who were drawing near to Jesus to hear him, and the elder brother represents the Pharisees who were criticizing Jesus for eating and hobnobbing with the wrong kind of people, it leaves the father playing the God role of going out to the boy, embracing the boy, hugging the boy, kissing the boy, celebrating with the boy. This is, as Helmut Thielicke, the German pastor, called him, the waiting father. So making the father God, the younger brother the prodigal, as we often call him, the tax collector and harlot, and the older brother, the Pharisees. It just seems natural to do that in the text. And that's Blomberg's thesis. And he's done a good job by putting this together for us. It's really sort of an epic book. It turned a corner in parable studies when it came out. He has, in addition to the Interpreting the Parables book, written one on just for preaching. And so if you're a teacher or a preacher, you might look at this one. It's just called Preaching the Parables, From Responsible Interpretation to Powerful Proclamation. And what he tries to do is give examples in his own preaching and teaching of what he was opting for in this particular one. So that's a preaching book. But there are other books that we ought to pay attention to as we gather our resources to try to do the best we can. And I want to mention several of those a little bit faster if I could. This is one by Harvey MacArthur and Robert Johnston entitled, They Also Taught in Parables. We sometimes forget that the form in which Jesus poured these teachings about the dynamic reign of God in the world, the kingdom, didn't get invented by him. Jesus took what was already out there and adapted it because it would be a common form that people would know. So this book is about the rabbinic parables. How did the people of Jesus' day tell stories? Are they exactly like Jesus's? We'll look at that a little later. Most of them are much shorter than Jesus's. Jesus's stories tend to be anecdotal and have quite a bit of story element to them. These are often proverbial, just very one or two sentences sometimes. And they will always start with the line, I will parable you a parable. So just know that, once again, going into the background, sometimes you need to say, what were the other people out there doing? Jesus said other people cast out demons. Well, guess what? Other people told stories and parables. And so this is a tool that might help us give a Jewish flavor to some of that. But beyond even the Jewish flavor, we probably need to take a look at this book by Stephen Voris called Preaching Parables, a Metaphoric Interfaith Approach. We probably have to widen our horizons a bit because, to be honest with you, the Jewish people, the Christian gospel, we're not the only ones telling parables. What about Muslim faith? What about Far Eastern faiths? What about Buddhism and Hinduism and other kinds? Do other people tell stories? Well, not near like the Bible in terms of quantity, amount, kind, but we can probably learn from some things here in a parable study. In fact, and this may surprise you, Jesus might draw more on the Greco-Roman parables, like even Syrian stuff, Aesop's fables, for instance, than he would on the Jewish literature. So expanding our horizons can sometimes be a help as well. Let me mention some other tools, some of which I have with me. This is one called Meet Yourself in the Parables. This title will be significant in a little while when we talk about the functions of the parable, because they function in part like a mirror. They look back at you. And Warren Wiersbe, who's done an awful lot of work with this, the famous voice on the Back to the Bible broadcast for years and years, he wrote this, Meet Yourself in the Parables. It has a study guide with it as well, and so for very low-to-the-ground practical stuff, it's helpful. John Sider has written a book just called Interpreting the Parables, same title as Dr. Blomberg's title, and this is just very close to the ground. The subtitle, A Hermeneutical Guide to Their Meaning. In other words, what are some of the principles of interpretation? Some of the exegetical principles that could be applied to understand them. Those will be helpful. David Wenham has just written a book called The Parables of Jesus. A lot of these titles are very similar. But he likewise, the advantage of this is he doesn't talk so much about the hermeneutical principles or the exegetical principles. He just does an exposition of the stories. So if you're teaching a Sunday school class or leading a home study or something, just to get you to the nuts and bolts of what these stories mean, this will go a long way to help you with that. A Church of Christ brother that's written on this subject is Prentice Meter, called Stories That Astonish. And one of the things you have to get your arms around when you teach on these stories is their incredible way that the shock value. It's just very, very high. Not all of the parables end that way, but often the parables of Jesus end with kind of a shocking statement or a story that started out in reality and then flies to fantasy. You just say, wow, could that really happen? But when that moment happens, it's a significant moment in the parable study, as we'll point out. And so this Church of Christ brother has put together those parables or stories that astonish. This book by Brian Stiller, called Preaching Parables to Postmoderns, I find helpful for this reason. Narrative wins the day. If we're wanting to evangelize our friends and speak a gospel word to them, we may want to start with story. I know one church planter that suggested the best way to plant a church is just tell the stories of Jesus. They wouldn't all have to be parables. But the postmodern mindset, which we maybe are coming toward the conclusion of, I'm not sure how to read culture all the time, it could well be that this part has run its course. Maybe we need to reinvent point and sermonic summons as opposed to just, story. But everybody and every culture, it seems transculture, loves a good story. And maybe it's stories that still can get our foot in the door best with our friends, speaking or teaching the parables to postmoderns. Now, those are some of the tools I brought with me. There are some other ones that are important to know. There's a British man by the name of Roy Clements, and he wrote a book called A Sting in the Tail. A sting in the tail. And just like a scorpion has a sting in the tail, many of the parables of Jesus end with kind of a gotcha moment, a sting. And that book is a little paperback. It may be difficult to get your hands on. IVP printed it, but over across the pond, not in the United States. And it's just a very helpful tool for saying, how do we reinvent the sting of the parable? We may not even teach it or preach it right if we don't reinvent it. Another one is by C.H. Dodd, just called The Parables of the Kingdom. And I will come back to Dodd by giving his definition of parable a little later, because he gave a definition that's just not been able to be topped since he gave it. Another one by William Herzog, entitled The Parables as Subversive Speech. It took me a while to get my arms around this, but I have come to the conclusion that Herzog is at least partly right, that what Jesus is doing is he's upsetting the apple cart. He is turning the world upside down, politically, socially, religiously, culturally, maybe even as far as gender goes, ethnically. He flip-flops the world because the world's not right. It's fallen, and the only way to get it back up is through Christ. And so, looking at the parables as God's way of subverting the culture is really brought out by William Herzog, The Parables as Subversive Speech. One last tool, two more tools that I might mention, is Joachim Jeremias' book called The Parables of Jesus. The reason that this is significant is he kind of set us off on a journey, along with a man by the name of Eulicher, to say, oh, don't worry about all this window dressing. It's just a story. Go to the main point. And for almost 50 years, we went down this road that said, don't worry about all the stuff around the edges, just try to get the main meaning. Well, certainly we want to try to get the main meaning, But can we give Jesus a little credibility for fleshing out his stories and making them not just truthful, but delightful for us? So Joachim Jeremias has to be looked at from the guy who kind of steered us back to the one-point thing, which now has been sort of, maybe not abandoned, but at least qualified. And one other is a book by Gary Burge, B-U-R-G-E, or Burgee, it might be pronounced, I'm not exactly sure. He just has a book called Jesus the Storyteller. And much like Kenneth Bailey, he's just trying to get his arms around what culture was Jesus a part of? And can we, in our modern culture, recreate what Jesus was trying to do with his stories? So, some resources. If Kenneth Bailey is right, that Jesus is a metaphoric theologian, we need all the help we can get to unpack these things, and I think these tools might just help us do that.